Let's take you back to London just to get a sense from the UK what's happening on the ground, as many countries are agreeing that the rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine is undesirable. US President Joe Biden calling for an urgent virtual meeting with G7 leaders. That's set for tomorrow. And of course, that will bring together Canada, France, Japan, Germany, Italy, the UK and the US. At the same time, NATO is also set to be holding a summit of the military alliance's 30 members to discuss the way forward. Well, let's find out now from the UK. Our correspondent in London is Olly Barratt, just to check what's happening there position-wise. Olly, we sorted out our technical problems, but very quickly, just let's begin there. Boris Johnson in the past, of course, speaking against, like most Western leaders, a possible Russian invasion, but it has happened since the early hours of this morning. What's the UK's position now?
Right, well, the UK's position now is that more sanctions will be forthcoming, more measures are going to be taken. The toughest sanctions the UK has ever imposed on Russia is what the UK is saying. Of course, Britain imposed some sanctions on Russian banks and several oligarchs earlier in the week. They clearly didn't have the intended effect, in the sense that Vladimir Putin went ahead with the invasion that the British and their allies were trying to avoid. Boris Johnson has addressed the nation today. It very much felt like a wartime address. He expressed support for Ukraine. He's talked over the last 24 hours about sending more defensive weapons to the Ukrainians so that they can defend themselves. Boris Johnson, in that address to the nation, saying he's convinced that Vladimir Putin's military ventures here will eventually fail, but he also held out the prospect of this being a protracted conflict.
So there's more sanctions and more military support. Of course, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so countries like the UK cannot go in there and fight alongside the Ukrainian army.
That's right. One thing that is being discussed here in the UK by some lawmakers is the idea that the UK could perhaps offer some air support to the Ukrainian military. That would be very controversial in and of itself. But another thing that the UK may well do militarily is boost its commitments to NATO when it comes to troop numbers in those Eastern European countries which are members of NATO and which crucially now potentially feel more threatened by Russia given what is unfolding in Ukraine. But you're quite right, we are not going to see British boots on the ground inside Ukraine. The further military support that is going to be on offer and that we know is forthcoming will be what Boris Johnson calls lethal defensive weapons, and that is things like anti-tank weapons.
Yeah. Now, is the UK and its allies bracing itself for a long drawn-out situation there in Ukraine, and with them having to support them with those defensive weapons for a long time? I mean, what's the sense ahead of the G7 meeting tomorrow?
Absolutely. Boris Johnson is making it very clear that he believes this could be a drawn-out conflict in Ukraine. He insists that he believes the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people will resist. He believes that Vladimir Putin has made a disastrous mistake for himself, but also for his people and the Russian country. The feeling from the UK all along has been that perhaps some countries around the world weren't taking the warnings that the Americans and the British were making about the imminence of an invasion seriously enough. And Boris Johnson says it's tragic now that effectively UK warnings have been correct so far, and if they continue to be correct, then, as you say, Boris Johnson is warning that this could be a conflict that drags on for some time in Europe.
The sentiment in the UK, just publicly, I mean, are people worried? Because one is hearing all kinds of expressions being used. I mean, this is like the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II, and things like that are being bandied about. Are people in the UK worried?
I think people in the UK are very worried indeed about what may be about to happen to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. There's a close relationship between London and Kiev at the moment. There's a large Ukrainian population here in Britain as well. There's, I think, a feeling here in Britain that this is likely to be a conflict that won't spill over in military terms in a way that might affect the British population, but there's anxiety about those prospects of some kind of conflict spreading nonetheless. And there is certainly financial uncertainty here too. British people are already, like many around the world, going through rising costs of living, huge rises in costs of energy, and those are expected to be adversely affected by what is unfolding in Ukraine and some of the sanctions that the UK and other Western allies might level against Moscow. That is very likely, it's considered, to feed through into energy bills for the average consumer, and so the British people, I think, are worried for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, even here in South Africa, because we buy oil globally, and hearing the news today that a barrel of oil is now over $100 US. For the first time in 7 years, has had many of us worried. Besides the worries and the concerns, do you get a sense that on the ground the sentiment is pro-Ukrainian in the UK? People are supportive of whatever measures the government under Boris Johnson might take in terms of this conflict on the side of Ukraine?
Yeah, there's polling to show that the British people do support the government stance to assist and support the Ukrainians in the face of this Russian incursion. Now, exactly what that support ends up being and whether the British people's support for it remains, of course, we will have to wait and see. But I think absolutely there is the sense here in the UK that the Ukrainians are the victim here, and that the UK should do whatever it can to support the Ukrainians. There is also polling, though, which would show that there's no strong support in the UK for putting boots on the ground inside Ukraine to assist against the Russian invasion. But as I say, that's not a realistic prospect at all at this point anyway. There's a huge amount of sympathy here, I think, for the Ukrainians. And as I say, for some time the British have been trying to support Ukraine. They've been sending in those weapons, but also for some years now the British military have been training the Ukrainian military too. So ties have really got closer in recent months and years as we've headed into this situation. And I think that feeds into the levels of support that the population here and the government here have for Ukraine.